And the manager just says, what's going on here? And this woman says, she won't let us sit down. We want to go and sit down. And I said, but Mr. Batten, that was his name, Batten. And I said, it's Hitchcock.
For decades, Carol Burnett has been celebrated as a legend of television comedy, a woman whose laughter, warmth, and razor-sharp timing helped shape an entire era of entertainment. Audiences saw the sparkle, the sketches, and the effortless chemistry she shared with millions of viewers every week. But behind the scenes of even the brightest careers lie moments of tension and relationships that are far more complicated than the public ever sees. There was one working partnership that stood apart from the rest in her long career, not because of scandal, but because of how deeply it challenged her patience and professionalism. It wasn't loud fights or public feuds. Instead, it was a clash of personalities, creative visions, and working styles that never quite blended, no matter how hard everyone tried. Those around them noticed the small signs first. Conversations that ended too quickly, rehearsals that felt heavier than usual, jokes that didn't land the same way off camera. Over time, the discomfort became impossible to ignore, and it quietly became known as one of the most difficult professional dynamics Carol had ever experienced. Now, as the stories from that era slowly resurface, a clearer picture is emerging, not of hatred, but of two talented people who simply could not find common ground. And the truth of what really happened says as much about Carol Burnett's strength and grace as it does about the pressures of comedy at the top. Carol Burnett's rise to fame was anything but accidental. From her earliest days on stage, she carried a blend of humility and fierce work ethic that made people gravitate toward her. When The Carol Burnett Show became a television landmark, audiences saw the laughter, the memorable characters, and the joyful chaos of sketch comedy at its best. What they did not always see were the pressures behind the scenes, the long rehearsals, the creative disagreements, and the constant balancing act of keeping a team together while delivering perfection week after week. Comedy looks effortless on television, but the process that creates it often requires intense focus and strong personalities. And sometimes those personalities simply don't mix. In Carol's case, that clash came in the form of a working relationship that, for many involved, felt like walking on delicate ground. This wasn't a tabloid feud or a dramatic explosion caught on camera. Instead, it was the quiet strain of two people who approached comedy from fundamentally different angles. Carol valued collaboration, patience, and respect for ensemble work. She came from a tradition where every performer on stage mattered and where kindness wasn't optional. The other person involved, talented in their own right, carried a style that felt sharper, more abrupt, and sometimes dismissive. Neither was wrong, they were simply incompatible. Yet, in a high-pressure environment like national television, even small incompatibilities can feel enormous. Crew members and writers often notice tension before the public ever does. They pick up on the pauses in conversation, the rehearsals that feel heavier than usual, the forced politeness that replaces genuine warmth. That is how this situation evolved. There were no public outbursts, but there were moments that lingered in the air longer than they should have. A joke cut too quickly. Feedback delivered without care. Rehearsals that ended with Carol retreating into quiet reflection rather than her typical laughter. For someone known for generosity of spirit, those moments weighed deeply. She had always believed in treating everyone on a set with dignity. And when she sensed that value being tested, it became harder to ignore. What makes Carol Burnett unique is not that she experienced friction. Almost everyone in entertainment does at some point, but how she responded to it. Instead of turning frustration into anger or public accusation, she doubled down on professionalism. She continued to give the same effort to the work, made sure audiences never felt the strain, and protected the dignity of everyone involved by refusing to turn private discomfort into public spectacle. She understood something fundamental. Reputations can be damaged easily, and words spoken in irritation can echo for decades. Silence, restraint, and focus on the craft became her answer. Privately, however, the experience left its mark. People who knew her well observed how deeply she cared about creating a warm, respectful environment. So when that atmosphere cracked, it struck her on a personal level. The pressure of running a hit show only magnified the weight of those moments. Sketch comedy requires trust. Trust that your partners will support you, that laughter is shared rather than competed for, and that each performer is safe to take creative risks. When that trust falters, even slightly, the stage can feel like the loneliest place in the world. For Carol, the realization that one working relationship would never fully find harmony was both sobering and clarifying. This difficult dynamic also revealed something important about leadership. Carol wasn't just a performer. She was a standard bearer. She had to think not only about herself, but about how energy on set affected everyone else. A single strained rapport could ripple outward, touching writers, camera crews, and fellow actors. Rather than escalating the problem, she focused on protecting her team. She emphasized kindness, redirected tension when possible, and found ways to insulate the work from the discomfort. That choice required strength, not the loud kind, but the quiet resilience that allows someone to keep showing up with grace. Even when circumstances are far from ideal. As years passed, stories from that era resurfaced in softer tones. People didn't describe hatred or scandal. They described two artists who could never quite align, like two musicians in the same band, each playing beautifully but in slightly different keys. The result wasn't harmony. It was strain. And yet the lesson that emerged from it became part of Carol Burnett's legacy. Success doesn't erase human vulnerability, and even the most beloved figures in entertainment must sometimes navigate relationships that test their patience and principles. As the situation unfolded, Carol Burnett found herself reflecting more deeply on what kind of environment she wanted to build around her work. She had always believed that comedy at its best comes from trust and generosity. On stage, performers lean into one another, share timing, and allow each other space to shine. When that rhythm is interrupted by tension or ego, even the funniest material begins to feel heavy. The difficult working relationship she encountered became a mirror, showing her how fragile creative chemistry can be. It reminded her that the atmosphere backstage is just as important as the laughter on camera. And it reinforced her conviction that kindness is not a luxury in entertainment, it is a necessity. Those close to Carol often say that she processes conflict quietly. She's not someone who rushes into dramatic confrontation. Instead, she listens, observes, and chooses her responses carefully. During that period, she poured much of her emotion into her work rather than into arguments. She focused on making the audience feel the same warmth they had always felt, even when the backstage environment didn't always reflect it. That ability to keep the product joyful while navigating private strain is part of what made her a true professional. It also took a toll because holding everything together requires energy that no one else can see. What made the dynamic especially challenging was that both people involved were undeniably talented. The difficulty didn't come from lack of skill, but from differences in temperament and approach. Carol valued collaboration. The other person worked more independently. She liked humor that invited everyone into the moment. He preferred humor that challenged and sometimes overshadowed others. Those stylistic contrasts slowly widened into emotional distance. There were rehearsals where laughter felt slightly forced, conversations that never quite relaxed, and decisions that left one side feeling unheard. Nothing happened loudly, but everything was felt deeply. In the world of television, schedules are relentless. There is little time to step back and process emotion when another show must be written, rehearsed, and filmed. That pace meant Carol had to keep moving, even when part of her wished things could simply slow down long enough for everyone to reset. Instead, she made a choice that would define how she handled conflict for the rest of her career. Rather than trying to change someone else's personality, she changed what she could control, her boundaries, her expectations, and the emotional distance she allowed the situation to have over her life. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about preserving her sense of purpose. The outside world, meanwhile, remained mostly unaware. Audiences saw only the polished episodes and spectacular comedy. They didn't see the quiet moments after rehearsal, when Carol would sit thoughtfully, replaying conversations in her head, wondering whether there was a better way to bridge the gap. They didn't see how strongly she believed in treating everyone with fairness, even when she felt frustrated or misunderstood herself. That sense of responsibility is the hallmark of a leader, and during that time, she wore it heavily. Looking back, it becomes clear that the real story is not about hostility. It is about the emotional cost of leadership. Carol Burnett was more than a performer. She was the emotional center of a creative family that millions watched every week. When harmony was disrupted, she felt accountable, even when the cause was beyond her control. That weight pushed her to grow in ways she didn't expect. She became more protective of her peace, more intentional about the people she worked with, and more aware that success does not shield anyone from difficult personalities or mismatched creative visions. The experience also deepened her compassion. Having lived through a strained collaboration, she became even more attuned to how others on set were feeling. She checked in more, listened more, and made sure no one else felt sidelined. In a way, the discomfort she endured became fuel for creating a kinder environment around her. That is perhaps the most telling part of her character. She turned tension not into bitterness, but into resolve. So when stories later surfaced hinting that there had once been a person she struggled with more than anyone, the truth beneath them was quieter and far more human. It was the story of two people who never quite found rhythm together, and of a woman who chose dignity over drama, instead of letting frustration harden into resentment. Carol Burnett carried the lesson forward, and allowed it to shape her into an even more thoughtful artist and leader. As the years continued, the experience of that strained relationship did not simply fade into the background of Carol Burnett's career. Instead, it became one of those quiet turning points that a person carries with them long after the cameras stop rolling. Carol had always believed that laughter had the power to heal, to bridge differences, and to make people feel less alone. But she also learned that laughter created in an atmosphere of tension required twice the emotional strength. The audience never suspected anything, and that was by design. Carol made sure that what people saw on screen was joy, even if some of what happened behind it required her to draw on deeper reserves of patience than she expected. The situation prompted her to rethink how she defined success. For many, success in television is measured solely by ratings, awards, and applause. For Carol, it expanded to include the quality of the experience itself. She began to ask herself new questions. Was the environment healthy? Did people feel respected? Was creativity being nurtured rather than drained? Those questions reshaped her choices going forward. The difficult collaboration didn't break her spirit, it sharpened her clarity about the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. She wanted her sets to be places where kindness and excellence coexisted, not places where people felt diminished for the sake of ego or control. Colleagues later noted that Carol became even more intentional about mentorship. She understood what it felt like to carry unspoken stress while still performing at the highest level. Younger performers were drawn to her not only because of her legendary career, but because she made them feel safe to fail, to experiment, and to be themselves. She never wanted anyone else to feel the same emotional weight she once carried during that difficult partnership. In that sense, the strain she endured helped her become an even more compassionate guide for others. Navigating the unpredictable currents of show business. It is also important to remember that comedy, despite its lighthearted surface, has always required immense vulnerability. To step onto a stage or in front of a camera and attempt to make millions of people laugh means exposing your instincts and your timing to constant judgment. When you add strained chemistry to that vulnerability, the challenge multiplies. Carol learned to build emotional armor without losing warmth, a balance that very few people ever master. She realized that it was possible to protect her boundaries without closing herself off completely, to remain generous without allowing herself to be taken for granted. The media, much later, would try to simplify this complex human experience into whispers about rivalry or harsh feelings. But real life rarely fits into such easy labels. The truth lay somewhere quieter, two professionals who never fully connected, and one of them carrying the responsibility of keeping the entire production afloat. Carol refused to let that story define her, but she also didn't pretend it never affected her. In private conversations, she sometimes spoke more broadly about how not every working relationship will be harmonious, no matter how talented the people involved may be. That honesty, shared without naming names or assigning blame, resonated deeply with those who listened. What stands out most about Carol Burnett during this period is her unwavering commitment to grace. Grace in how she spoke, and how she worked, and in how she allowed herself to move forward. She chose not to retaliate, not to humiliate, and not to turn personal discomfort into public spectacle. Instead, she turned inward, reflected, and allowed the lessons to inform her future. That quiet strength is part of why she remains admired not just as a comedian, but as a person. Eventually, the emotional ripples softened. Time created distance, perspective grew clearer, and the once heavy memories lost some of their sharpness. Yet the wisdom remained. Carol knew now that even icons experience seasons of strain, and that the true measure of character is not avoiding difficulty, but responding to it with dignity. The relationship that once weighed on her became, in hindsight, a teacher. It taught her about boundaries, about leadership, and about the importance of choosing collaborators whose values align with her own. So when people look back and speculate about the one person she may have struggled with more than anyone else, the deeper meaning lies beyond the gossip. It lies in how she handled herself when the situation was hardest. It lies in the fact that she protected others from the fallout, carried herself with quiet resilience, and emerged with a stronger sense of who she was and what she stood for. That, more than any rumor, is the real story. In the final measure of Carol Burnett's long and extraordinary journey, the episode of her most difficult working relationship becomes just one thread in a much larger tapestry. It did not define her career, but it did help shape her understanding of people, pressure, and the unseen realities of success. When audiences remember Carol, they remember the infectious laugh, the impeccable timing, the generosity with co-stars, and the ability to turn life's absurdities into something healing. Yet behind all of that was a woman who had navigated real tension with grace and quietly learned from it. What she carried forward was less about the person involved, and more about the insight the experience gave her. She learned that you cannot always control who crosses your path, but you can always control how you respond. She discovered that boundaries and kindness can coexist, that you can step back from a difficult dynamic without turning it into warfare. That realization proved invaluable not only in her professional life but in her personal one as well. She became more intentional about preserving her peace, about recognizing early signs of emotional strain, and about choosing collaborators who shared respect for others as a non-negotiable value. As time went on, Carol also spoke more openly, not in the language of gossip, but in the language of wisdom, about the emotional costs of show business. She reminded younger performers that success does not erase insecurity or conflict. Even the brightest sets can hold shadows, and even the kindest people may face situations that test every ounce of patience. What mattered, she emphasized, was not pretending those moments didn't exist, but refusing to let them harden the heart. The very fact that she could turn a bruising experience into compassionate advice demonstrates the inner strength that has defined her life. In a broader sense, the story underscores a truth about creative work that audiences rarely see. Great comedy often emerges from disciplined structures, vulnerable performers, and complex personalities. Not every combination clicks. Some pairings produce seamless magic. Others require endurance and diplomacy more than joy. Carol learned this firsthand. She did not deny the discomfort she once felt, but neither did she allow it to become bitterness. She learned to release it, to let the experience exist as something she went through, learned from, and ultimately outgrew. Perhaps the most powerful element of this story is how clearly it reveals Carol Burnett's character. She had the platform, the fame, and the influence to turn her frustrations into public controversy if she had chosen to. She could have named names, assigned blame, and added fuel to the very rumor mill she had outlasted her entire career. Instead, she stayed silent where silence was kind and spoke only where reflection could help others. That restraint is not weakness. It is discipline. It comes from understanding the long life of words once they are spoken, and from valuing dignity over headlines. Eventually, the tension that once seemed so heavy became only a memory. The show continued, her legacy deepened, and the laughter she created outlasted every uncomfortable rehearsal and awkward exchange. The difficult collaboration became a story without villains, only two people who could not find the same rhythm, and one leader who refused to let that disharmony fracture the bigger picture. Time has a way of softening edges, and with distance, the experience looks like conflict and more like education.